So people don't necessarily remember all the places where they have been. Sometimes people don't necessarily want to tell about all the places they have been. And also sometimes the people know the places where they have been, but they have no way of knowing who else was there. Like if I sit next to somebody on a bus, I don't know who that is. If I sit next to somebody in a cafe, I have no idea who that is, if that somebody is just in the next table. Presumably I know those people I go to the cafe with, but there are a lot of possible contacts which we can't trace using the classical approach, and HOIA is intended to help with that. So, for some reason slides do not want to advance. So what HOIA is a smartphone app with a goal to warn the user of the app when they have been in close contact with a COVID-infected person. And it also has the goal of doing it without tracking anybody's location. So there will be no location tracking. The only event that is recorded is that your phone was close to somebody else's phone, but it is not recorded where this happened. It also has a goal of doing this contact tracing or exposure tracing without revealing anybody's identities. Your app learns that it was close to somebody else's phone with an app, but does not learn whose phone it was. And also the tracing is done without revealing anybody's social graphs. So even in anonymized ways, if I know that that phone A has been in contact with phone B and phone C, and phone C has been in contact with phone D, this shape of the graph is often sufficient to re-identify who is the owner of the phone A, who is the owner of phone B, but no such graph is built anywhere in the system. So this really privacy was a primary concern in designing the protocols and in designing this app. The Estonian app more specifically was built by a consortium of 12 companies. It just so happens that I'm here speaking today, even if my part personally in building this app was quite small. But obviously we can't line up all the 50 people who were involved in one way or another here, and it makes no sense. But this was really a big community effort. All the companies were working pro bono, with no payment, just because the people in the companies, the owners of companies, believe this is a useful thing to do, and so we just got together and built it. The state was represented in this endeavor by Ministry of Social Affairs, and in particular by Health Board, who is doing current contact tracing activities, and by Health and Welfare Information Systems Center, known locally as TEHIC, who will take over and actually has already taken over in operating the server-side components of supporting the app. So this is from the companies. Igloo was doing mostly project management and a lot of application design. Velvet was doing website design, communications, also translations of all the texts, both in the app and outside. Mobilab was leading the development effort for the app itself on the phone, assisted by Fob and Mooncascade with development, and by ByteLogix and Fujitsu with consultations. Icefire built the server-side things, the things that had to be built from anew, and Hazy was doing the development work to make the national electronic health records interoperable with this app and the services. ASA was doing testing, as you might imagine from the name of the company. Cybernetica was doing a lot of security engineering and security analysis, and Guardtime, we assisted them in this analysis and engineering. So that's roughly the outline of who did what. The general architecture of the system consists of 3 major layers built on top of each other. So the HOIA app itself is responsible for showing the user interface in the phone. The user interface is minimalist, and this is by design, because this is not an app that users are supposed to be looking at all the time and interacting with all the time. It's supposed to be working in the background. The app is built on top of Google and Apple exposure notification services, which is an update to the Android and iOS operating systems, respectively. And these are the ones which are doing the actual contact tracing while the app is in the background. And the protocol itself, the Google-Apple protocol, is built on top of the protocol designed by the DP3T, the Decentralized Privacy Preserving Proximity Tracing Project, which was started by the EFPL in Switzerland, researchers at EFPL, and included international contributions from other researchers as well. But EFPL has been the core of development of this protocol. And this DP3T project also put out SDKs for building apps on phones and some core components for building the backend supporting databases. And so we used those and built our integrations around those components in order to reduce the amount of work that we have to do locally. So the most important part or question of my part of the presentation is how does it actually work, and why do we say that we can trace contacts without breaching anybody's privacy. So the idea is in your phone there is a HOIA app itself, and then there is this underlying service provided by the operating system of the phone, by Google on Android phones and by Apple on iPhones. And in this normal tracing mode, basically the function of the app is just to tell the underlying service to start working. And that's it. So the app really, in this mode, the app really does very little. And what happens inside this service is that the service is generating random or technically pseudo-random identifiers. And first, what it does, it broadcasts the identifiers, the pseudo-randomly generated identifiers, over Bluetooth, where other phones with the app can notice them and can log them. And secondly, it also remembers those identifiers. And then in parallel of generating their own identifiers and broadcasting them, the service also listens for similar broadcasts from other phones and keeps track of what identifiers it has seen. So inside this GAN service are two databases. One is a list of those unique identifiers that the app has generated and broadcast, and another one is a list of unique identifiers that the app has received from others around it. And the identifiers are generated pseudo-randomly. They have no connection to the identity of the owner of the phone or to the identity of the phone. They are just random numbers. Also, they have no connection to the location of the phone. And so now this is what happens during the normal tracing phase of the use of the app. Now what happens when the owner of the phone gets ill, is diagnosed with COVID, then what happens is that the owner of the phone allows the app to announce this or to alert others around them. And this happens in two steps, or roughly. So the first one is that since we don't want people to use this app to prank other people, like when a school kid doesn't feel like going to school tomorrow, they could decide to mark themselves as ill to shut down the school. And this is definitely a use case that we want to avoid for this app. So what happens is that in order to announce your illness, you first have to confirm it. And this happens by connecting the national electronic medical records to verify that you actually have a valid diagnosis. So this can be based on a lab report or on a doctor diagnosing you. But the app does not allow you to declare yourself ill with COVID just by your own free will. And in order to enable validation of this fact without revealing again your identity or anything else, except that this request comes from somebody with a valid COVID diagnosis, the app generates another random number. And alongside with your request to confirm your diagnosis, this random number is sent to a supporting service inside this electronic medical records database. If the records database determines that the user who has logged in actually does have a valid diagnosis, then this random number, essentially a password, if you will, is forwarded to a backend service which is built specifically to support the Hoya app. And now, once this has been done, and the confirmation is also relayed back to the application, then what the application does, the application pulls out the randomly generated keys from the log for those days when the user was infectious. So this date range is determined from medical considerations. I'm not sure off the top of my head how many days before, how many days after diagnosis it is. But this is some specific range of dates, about 1 week long. And the random numbers for those dates are pulled out from the database inside your app or inside your phone, and then uploaded into a shared global database outside. And this password is sent along with this data upload to verify that this upload actually comes from somebody with a valid diagnosis. So this is why in order to announce your illness or your diagnosis, you have to log into the medical records to avoid misuse of the app to annoy other people. And then on the receiving end, then every now and then the app connects to the database and downloads all the new keys that have been uploaded to the database in the meantime, and passes them on into this exposure notification service inside your phone for verification for comparison with a list of IDs that the phone has recorded as having been close to your phone. So these are, again, the identifiers. You don't know whose identifiers they are. They're just random numbers, but they come from different sources. One source is the log of the identifiers that your phone has observed as being close to yours. And the other one is downloaded from the database, the list of identifiers who are known to be related to people who are actually ill. And then the operating system does a comparison according to given criteria and sends back a response of how many matches there are and how strong was the Bluetooth signal at the moment when the match was recorded, or when the matched identifier was recorded. And then based on that, the cumulative exposure load is computed, and if this exceeds a threshold, the app displays you a warning that you have been too close to somebody who is ill, and you should be taking measures. And the measures are currently that you should stay home, you should monitor your own health, and if you develop any symptoms that might indicate COVID, you should contact your doctor for a proper diagnosis. So that's basically the user experience or user flow. The app really has very little functions. It is very specialized. And the critical thing for privacy is that the matching between the known infected keys and the keys that you have observed is done locally on your phone. The alert is issued locally on your phone. Nobody except you learns about it, unless, of course, you go and show your alert on your phone to somebody, but that's your own decision. But the app itself doesn't go out to tell anybody else that you have been close to an infected person, so you are the only one who knows of this matching. So for the more technically inclined audience, a little bit details on how those random keys and random identifiers are generated. So every day a completely random value, a random key is generated, which is called a temporary exposure key. So this is like a daily rotating key, random number. And from this this base key, two helper keys are derived. One is so-called rolling proximity identifier key, which is derived from this temporary exposure key using a one-way function. And this is used to generate the identifiers that your phone propagates to people and other phones around you. And the actual identifier that is being broadcast is computed from this rolling key by combining it with a time. And the time element comes in from this. So every Bluetooth radio has, this is basically like a Wi-Fi card. It has a network address. And so that the Bluetooth devices themselves cannot be used to track people, more recent versions of the Bluetooth protocol already have this feature that they do change their network address every now and then by itself already. And what this exposure notification protocol does is that it combines the time. Every time when the MAC address changes, it computes a new proximity identifier using the, on one hand, as one input, the proximity identifier key, which is specific to your device, and on the other hand, the time, the interval, the time number. So the key is related to time in 10-minute increments. So this time in 10-minute increments and the identifier key, they are combined to compute the identifier, and this identifier is actually the value that your phone is broadcasting. And this two-level process for deriving those keys is made for the purpose of optimizing network traffic. So since these computations are done using one-way functions, then when you declare yourself ill, the only thing that needs to be uploaded into this central database is this temporary exposure key. And the only thing that other phones need to download from this database is this temporary exposure key. All those proximity identifier keys and the proximity identifier numbers corresponding to different time values, they can be computed or regenerated locally on the receiving phone. So they are generated or regenerated on the phone. The comparison with the phone's log, other phone's log is made, and after that the data can be thrown away, and this reduces significantly the amount of data that all the phones have to upload and download. So this is basically to help you with your data traffic limits, so that the app doesn't eat too much of your data quota on your phone. Another key is generated also from the temporary exposure key. The other helper key is called associated encrypted metadata key, and this is used to encrypt some additional data that is broadcast by the phone alongside with the proximity identifier. And the main thing in the metadata is the power level of the Bluetooth radio of the sending phone. And this is needed to compute whether the exposure is significant or not. And the exposure estimation is computed from two parameters. First, distance, how far the two phones are from each other. And the expectation is that people are carrying their phones on their persons. So the distance between phones is a good approximation for the distance between people. Of course, if you go to a sports club and you leave your phone in the locker and go to the gym yourself, then this assumption is broken. And for that reason, if you do things like that, if you go to work and leave your phone in a locker because you work in a place where you change for work, then it's actually sensible to switch off your phone or to switch off Bluetooth so that you don't get false positive results. But as long as you keep your phone on you, then the distance between two phones is a good approximation for the distance between two people. And the distance between phones is estimated from the signal attenuation, which is the difference between the sending level and the difference between the receiving level of the signal. And the sending level is included in this encrypted metadata that is broadcast together with identifier, which you can't decrypt until the keys, until the other person declares themselves ill and uploads the key. You can't decrypt it before, but once this has happened, you can derive from the temporary exposure key, you can derive the associated metadata key, and then you can decrypt it. And then your phone, when your phone records the received identifier, the phone also records the associated encrypted data and the signal level, how strong the signal was at this moment from this radio. And then after decrypting this sending level and comparing it to the receiving signal level, this can be used to estimate the distance between those two phones. Second parameter that goes into the computation is duration, for how long the signal was received. And then the signal strength levels are classified into three levels, basically close, not so close, and further away. And each of them, then the duration for how long you were close, how long you were sort of close, and how long you were not so close, to those durations are aggregated, and then a weighted sum is computed as your exposure score. And if this goes over a threshold, then you get an alert from your phone. This is roughly the idea. The specific numbers of what is the signal strength and what is the weight, those there are some initial values put into the app now. They may change in the future because research is being done on those on what those values would be optimally in several places in the world, and we are monitoring this research, and we may change settings at some point. This is basically last of my slides. So Don, you can already try to get ready with your presentation. Some frequently asked questions, which I perhaps should address, and then we can go to the more specific questions posted to Slido after Don has also finished his presentation. In the discussion section, we can take the non-standard questions. But the most standard one is, why do I need to allow location services on Android? You promised that the app does not track my location. And this is only due to the legacy Android permission system. In the permission system inside Android kernel, Bluetooth and GPS are enabled or disabled using the same switch, basically. And the application, in order for the Bluetooth to work, you need to enable the location services, but the application itself never tracks your location. In fact, the permission system is kind of, the granularity of permission system in different parts of Android is different. So you need to switch on the location services to be able to switch on Bluetooth. But the application, the permissions that the application asks from the operating system are actually separate. And you can check that the HOIA application does not request permission to access location of your device. This is expected to change with the next Android update. But of course, if you are on a phone that does not receive operating system updates anymore, you will not get this update, and you will be stuck with this problem as long as your operating system is not updated. The reason why this Bluetooth tracking was even able to bypass this limitation was that Google put it as this exposure notification service as part of the Google Play services, which are updated through Google Play Store, so bypassing the manufacturers of the phone. But updates to the Android kernel have to go through the manufacturer of the phone. Google cannot push it onto your phone directly, this update. So if for this update, you are at the mercy of your phone's manufacturer. Another one, which probably is not so much a problem with English-speaking audience, but why in Estonian-speaking audience, it turns out there are a lot of people who have the operating system set to English and then want to use applications on top of that in Estonian. And this is something that was not anticipated in the initial version of the app, which always aligns its own user interface language according to the operating system language. This will, since people have asked for it, this will come in a future update. The possibility to switch the language within the application. And the reason, the last question, what about traveling? The background for this question is actually another question, why do we need a separate application for Estonia? Why can't we just copy one from, I don't know, Switzerland or Latvia? They were both out there with their apps before. And the reason why each country needs a separate app is that the infection confirmation process, the interface to the local health system, is different in each country. The Swiss and the Latvian apps do not know about the interface to the Estonian electronic medical records and would not be able to confirm your diagnosis. And because of this, at least some part of the app has to be changed. And in fact, we started from the app developed by the Swiss, and we modified it to communicate with the Estonian system. And of course, we also added the Estonian design and the user interface. And considering this, the question also is, what about traveling? And in the future, this is not currently implemented anywhere, but the intention is that in the future, everybody will be able to use their own app, and cross-border data exchange is implemented by data exchange between those background servers. So the Estonian server will share the list of known identified keys with the Latvian server, and the Latvian backend server will share their list of known infected keys with the Estonian server. And then when a user in the app notifies that they have been to Latvia recently, their app will download, in addition to the Estonian keys, also the Latvian keys from the Estonian server, and will get notifications if there are any matches. This is the easiest way. It's not sure for now whether the user will have to declare that I have been to Latvia, or that I'm going to Latvia and start downloading those Latvian keys from the server, or whether the app will be able to automatically pick this up from the roaming info. This is still work in progress, but the general idea is that the data exchange cross-country will only happen in between the backend servers, so your phone will not have to be able to talk in addition to the Estonian server also to Latvian and Finnish if you travel between those three countries. You will always talk to the local server. And for further reading, so we have the website for Hoya in the link is to the main one, but the website is available in 3 languages, Estonian, English, Russian, so you can read the background information there. There is a lot of frequently asked questions also, which you can read. The source code of the app and also background supporting services and also some documentation is posted into the Koodivaramu source code repository. The documentation out in the repository for now is in Estonian only, so you will need perhaps some help to read it. I haven't tried how good Google Translate works on it, but considering that it has quite a lot of specific terminology from both medicine and IT, I'm not very optimistic. But you can try. Maybe Google surprises me or you. If you want to learn more about the Google and Apple components that they have built into their operating systems and what their plans are, there are some pages where they post things. And if you want to have more background in what DP3T has done, all the components, there is also a reference. They have everything on GitHub. They have tons of documentation on the design of the protocol, on the risk analysis, on the cryptographic analysis, everything. Probably more than you can read. And it's all in English. And that's it from me.
Yeah, one question just actually. Will you make the slides available?
Yeah, I think so, yes.
Okay. But then can we continue with 10? All the other questions will be later then. Yeah, we cannot hear.
At least.
That's better.
So you can hear me better now. Also, I can hear myself in an echo. I had the suggestion that maybe Otto wants to answer some of the questions, for example, the one from Georgios and Marco and Anonymous, and possibly I can take all these questions in the end, or we can take the questions in the end with Otto together. How does the host suggest?
A presentation first, actually, and then let's go to the questions.
I can't hear you now, so.
Oh. Okay. Can you please actually do your presentation, and then in the end we will go to the questions.
Perfect. Perfect. Let me start sharing my screen. My humble apologies for not being able to be there in person. And here come the slides. I believe you can see them now. My name is Dan. I'm from Cybernetica, and as Otto explained, Cybernetica has been responsible for the security engineering and analysis in this project. And that also sometimes includes international relations with other countries for interoperability and sharing the best practices. So I have two parts in my presentation. The first one is an incomplete history of app-based contact tracing in Europe and actually the rest of the world. And the second part is going to be about how we did the actual security engineering for this project. So first is, we start somewhere around March 2020. Start of the crisis, solutions are being sought. The European Union countries, several of them invoke some form of emergency powers and start isolating themselves. So no more travel, lockdowns, and so on. Epidemiologists and data scientists start pressuring governments for access to health data and also location tracking data for whole populations. On the other hand, Singapore comes up with a clever idea for an app called Trace Together, which is the first large-scale and relatively successful Bluetooth-based contact tracing application. But the Singapore app has a problem. And what that is, that it actually generates the keys that Otto explained to you about, not on the phone, but in a server. Meaning that your phone wouldn't generate all the keys itself, but instead it would do it on a government-controlled server, meaning that effectively the Singapore government could build the social graph of everybody meeting. In the our design, it is circumvented by actually doing all the generation on the phone, and the government does not have access to all the rolling keys. In Singapore, that was different. Now, obviously, certain countries would want more social graph data, more epidemiological data. So this is not bad as is. However, it turned out that Apple phones, iOS phones, have a privacy feature which prevents Bluetooth low energy beacons from working when your app is in the background. That meant that Trace Together did not work very well on iPhones unless you left your phone on at all times and did not allow it to go to sleep, which was very bad for batteries. And this was one of the reasons why Trace Together was not super helpful, at least on iPhones. At the same time, there were other countries and other systems being built. South Korea had a very awesome data integration platform, which would link your mobile phone location data, your credit card payments, CCTV data, and quite a bit of other information. If you were a suspected COVID, if you had a COVID infection. So this is documented in the medical journals, and it was considered intrusive yet quite a bit effective as well. But obviously not all countries are willing to go down that route. Israel was one of the early countries to announce an app. In the original plan, they were planning to use GPS data for contact tracing. And in fact, GPS data would be quite accurate for this purpose. But for example, it is estimated that mobile phone location data measured by the telecom operators by triangulating people from cell towers would not be accurate enough. And that's also when the first privacy people and data protection people started asking questions. When the United Kingdom National Health Service started considering an app, researchers wrote an open letter asking for ethical best practices to be followed. And that was one of the first open letters to that regard. And I do have all the links to these news items in the bottom of the slides, and I will do my best and work with Taltech to make the slides available for all of you. So let's come back to one of the discussion points we had in March and April. The governments were very interested in knowing, do we need a lockdown? How much of a lockdown do we need? And for that, number of interventions were imagined. For example, there were companies who have access to mobile phone location data from various places. Then they were starting to draw up these COVID-19 traveling maps. For example, here is one from a heat map from people moving, which showed that during spring break, there was quite a lot of activity in Florida and so on. So people were moving around, transferring the virus around, and that's how it spread so nicely. In Estonia, there were also discussions of using mobile phone location data to measure how much people move. And that would apply to everybody who has a mobile phone, to the whole population. And there was a discussion going on among the telecom operators and the Statistics Estonia. And in the end, Statistics Estonia promised that mobile phone location data would be anonymized and everything would be done very securely. But there was a significant, let's say, kickback to that idea. So in the end, actually, a much more elegant solution was implemented. And in that solution, the telecom operators performed quite a lot of pre-aggregation at the operator side, so that everybody's movement data never reached the statistics office. And they only had to take the aggregates and visualize them with help from Positium, a company specializing in mobile phone location data analytics. They are very good at it. So it was also a time of innovation when we saw that even when there is a crisis, you can figure out ways how to support your government and support your population without building increasing surveillance infrastructures. So it was April 2020 when more similar efforts were launched. In late March already, in Germany, the privacy enhanced proximity tracing project started. They were promising a private cross-border app and were following pretty much the same design ideas that Singapore had, meaning that they would have same kind of problems that Singapore had. In early stages, PEP-PT was also related to another project called DP3T. And DP3T, as Otto explained, stands for Distributed Privacy Preserving Proximity Tracing. DP3T is a project led by the EPFL University in Lausanne, Switzerland, but it has team members from ETH Zurich, from University College London, from US, and actually from a whole lot of places. Very similar to proposed in Boston University in the States. It took 4 days for DP3T and PEP-PT to disagree on privacy goals, and that was a significant milestone in the whole decentralized versus centralized flame war that continued for quite a while. So what is considered centralized? The original Singapore trace together design, despite explaining its privacy preserving qualities for using Bluetooth instead of GPS, for example, is still being considered centralized for the sole reason that in the trace together solution, it is possible for a central service provider to determine the social graph, who is talking to whom. The fact is also that the Singapore design also has the mobile phone number used as an identifier. DP3T, on the other hand, was preaching a different solution where basically all the private information would be stored on the person's own phone, which would significantly reduce the attack surface for privacy. Basically, only when you become ill would you be sharing information with the government, and the government would only be there to share your key with the rest of the phones so that they could calculate whether they have been in touch. The government would have no way for determining the social graph. And in Estonia, at least, the government health board knows when you are ill anyway. So the app would not make anything less private. In the background, the DP3T project had been working with Apple and Google, who had also been working with Stanford and some other academics. And Apple and Google on April 10th launched the exposure notification API. And this was an interesting, but very technologically, politically interesting moment, because Apple and Google said that with our API, you can only build decentralized apps, meaning that they would build custom APIs into their operating systems that would support the Bluetooth signaling, ensure that it works in the background, it's interoperable between Android and iOS phones, and it's built securely into the operating systems. However, they would not support centralized ID generation, and they would not support apps that try to determine the social graph. And this was a very, very important moment, because essentially they picked sides in a certain amount of battles, and I will explain later what the battles were. Also, April 19th, 300 security researchers signed an open letter noting the privacy differences between decentralized and centralized apps, and the whole discussion went way through April. However, in April, Norway, of all countries, launched an app that was using full GPS tracking of everybody. And I will get back to that in a few moments. May 2020. This was the moment that many privacy and data protection people did not expect that was coming. Apple and Google shipped the exposure notification API as an operating system update. It was done surprisingly quickly, and yeah, that was it. It was then available, and countries could start building against it. The discussions were still very heavy. UK, France, Norway, India justified centralized ID generation for epidemiological analysis. However, several countries in Europe switched to on-device ID generation, going for the Google Apple Exposure Notification API, or GAEN as it's abbreviated these days. Austria was one of the first countries to switch. Others joined later. Privacy people could not understand what they were seeing. Usually when we talk about Apple, Google, and the big technology companies, then they try to ensure that more data gets collected. However, in this particular case, interestingly, Apple and Google had picked the side of fighting against the governments on a different battle. There were EU governments trying to put together political fronts in trying to convince Apple and Google to support centralized contact tracing applications and arguably make iOS and Android less private. You can argue whether this is the case, but that was what happened. And while this is a dangerous precedent for the governance of technology, in the sense that technology companies telling governments how data should be collecting and how much data should be collected is a sort of a scary outlook. Then in this particular case, they also made the apps more private as a result. So we will see in the future whether the goodwill of the tech companies actually pays off, whether they regret building this exposure notification API or not, and how all this will happen. 10 plus countries, as a result, joined up to propose a cross-border interoperability scheme, meaning that travelers could go to other countries and then the Bluetooth signaling would continue working, and when they go home and anybody marks themselves as ill in the host country or the target country, everybody would still get notifications despite which country they were from. And this is something that was very nicely supported by the whole exposure notification API. If you were building on that API, then interoperability would come to you almost for free because the keys would be interoperable. They would be compatible with each other across borders. The European Commission, as was expected, started coordinating an interoperability working group. Actually, Germany took a very significant lead in that. And the initial focus was indeed on decentralized solutions. We were in some of those early calls and understood that indeed the decentralized solutions were going to be the first ones to achieve interoperability. And Switzerland, who had until then developed their own software stack, including the whole Bluetooth signaling API, including having the Swiss Army walk around in mobile phones and sit on chairs as if they were on a train to do measurements and whether the Bluetooth-based tracing actually works and how strong signals should be so you could actually measure them. They had to throw quite a bit of it away, and because their parts of their protocol were now implemented as parts of iOS and Android, then they moved their code base to also work on the exposure notification API. Here the jury is still out, but based on the information that I could collect, at least close testing on the exposure notification API, Switzerland had at least one of the first apps ready. So summer 2020, a lot of launches. While still in May, UK NHS was testing an app based on centralized design on the Isle of Wight. Then a few months later, it was missing in action. And in June, they announced that they would be also switching to the exposure notification API. Latvia launched Up to Recovid in early June 2020, based on the Google Apple exposure notification API. Italy launched Immuni in June 2020. France launched Stop COVID, which was not based on the exposure notification API. The launch did not go very well. There were security issues and the phone and the app reached low adoption rates. In June, also, Norway's Data Protection Authority ruled that the GPS-based contact tracing app has to be stopped and the health authority has to delete all the data related to it. This happened, so Norway currently does not have a running app as far as I am aware. Then Germany launched Corona-Warn on June 16th, 2020, and it reached something like 10 million downloads in the first week. And this happened in Germany, which is a very privacy-aware country. Right now, I think Germany has about 25% of app penetration in the whole population, which is very impressive. Estonia launched the Hoya app on August 20th based on DP3T SDKs and the exposure notification API. And the European Interoperability Consortium started reaching its first pilots. So this is where we are right now. We have launched apps in many European countries. We are starting to build for interoperability. Apple and Google are shipping new updates to the APIs. trying to make everything simpler, have less friction in the whole processes, and interoperability. Well, I don't want to give out dates because it will take some time before the countries actually agree to talk to each other across the internet. This is standard diplomacy, technology diplomacy, which takes its time. So, as a second topic, I would like to share with you how we did the security and privacy engineering aspect of HOIA. This is interesting to everyone who's ever worked on security of software. And let's start with the principles first. Given that we had a consortium of 12 companies who had been setting up Slack channels, daily stand-up calls, and all the other modern agile software development practices to start development, then this needed a somewhat different kind of project management. If you have few centralized developers, then your security engineering can be this good, but it's easier to have, let's say, it's easier to ensure that the security is baked into the whole system when you have a very formal and centralized development process. Whether you do it or not is a different topic, of course. TEHIC, the Healthcare Information Systems Center, would be the operator of all the IT systems of Estonian healthcare anyway. So they set up Git repositories, wikis, Confluence, and all the deployment environments, all the virtualization, containerization, and all the other cool modern environments, including monitoring and logging. TEHIC did a very good job here. And several other partners helped with certain jobs. Some outside translation help was needed. There was some penetration testing that Clarified Security did on the app and its interfaces. And transparency was an important aspect. All the code and documentation was made available under the EUPL, which also works for both code and licenses, code and software, code and documentation, I mean. And the documentation includes the security analysis and security testing. And arguably, as much as I've asked around, in Estonian software, this is one of the most thorough security analysis that has been published. There's probably work done in Estonia which is more thorough and has been done over tens of years. Internet voting comes to mind. But here we had a pretty short time span and limited resources, so it's a good example of software security engineering. So the process looked like this. We start with an attacker model. So what can be attacked? And then we start with security requirements, things that are, let's say, less dependent on the attacker model and just things that we want to be there for sure. Based on the attacker model and security requirements, we put in place security controls, meaning like where do we use encryption, where do we authenticate, what kind of access control do we have in place, and so on. And then we go into application development. So here, for this app, I can say with full pride that for Hoya, before any code was written, we basically had a security and privacy architecture in place. We knew that the DB3T framework would give us the majority of what we need. And we also knew that the rest, we would get quite a lot from TEHIC and their security policies from government cloud, and that we just had to piece everything together in the right way. So when the application was developed after development before release, we went through the pre-release testing phase, and then a release on App Store and Google Play Store, and then the backend was deployed at TEHIC. So how do we talk about attacker models? We start with the attack surface. And this particular attack surface comes from a document that ENISA wrote. ENISA is like the European Cybersecurity Agency. And they wrote a helpful report named Cybersecurity Requirements and Testing for COVID-19 Apps. And this was very helpful for us because we could fast track our development of the security model quite a bit. For example, this particular figure you see here was most helpful for us because it basically gave us one figure to use. And here you see that every circle is a potential attack surface. It's an artifact like application backend, like the smartphone app, like the smartphone app store, which is also a part of our security model. And also there's the application development and deployment process, including the code repository and so on. And obviously, several of these components talk to each other over communication lines, like the application to backend connection and the smartphone app store connection and so on. So if you're an attacker, then you can try to attack any of these components, and we have to have a response. So the solution was that we put together a threat catalog, and it had 5 categories in it. OR was threats from attacks against the app and its users, or ohud rakendusele. OS, threats from attacks against communication channels, ohud sidele. OT, threats from attacks against the backend, ohud teenusele. OA, threats from attacks against the development team, ohud arendusmeeskonnale. And OP, threats from attacks against user privacy, ohud privaatsusele. The OP category was a specific one. Technically, it could fall under OR, app and its users, or the communications or anything. But because privacy for us was a cross-cutting concern, then we wanted to make it separate and show that we have thought about quite a bit of the attacks that are there. So if you want to look at the document, then it's available under the link below, and it's partially based on the DP3T risk analysis documents. And let me give you an example for an attack in the OP category. Consider for a moment that there is an attacker who has a Bluetooth amplifier. What they then do is they go around with an infected person, and then they try to broadcast or amplify the Bluetooth signals shared by their phone. Basically, the point of this attack is not so much privacy, but it's more as an integrity. But what the result would be is that if by the signals from the phone, then we could make people's phones think that they are ill later, even if they are not. And this would in turn reduce trust in the app, which would in turn reduce people's trust that the app works, and would possibly create a situation where people say that because the app is so privacy preserving, then it actually does not work. And the response to this would obviously be that you analyze what's the actual probability that something like this happens. So, for example, how reasonable it is that somebody goes and starts walking around the Ülemiste shopping center or Kristiine Keskus or someplace and has a big Bluetooth amplifier antenna on top of their head, and somehow they also manage to stay within people's range for 10 minutes, because that's how long it takes to ensure that the target phone picks you up as a contact. So having considered how hard it is to launch such an attack, then we decided that this is not an attack that we have to fight against heavily, because a similar or even more damaging attacks could be launched without this app being present, by just going, writing in the media and claiming that my phone told me that I am ill when I am not. Because we can't check if you've got a notification. The app developers or the government does not know that you have actually gotten notifications. This is really, this makes metrics and monitoring quite hard, but it also improves privacy quite a lot. We don't know if you have been in touch with somebody who is ill. We will only know it when you mark yourselves as ill, when you have become so, and then act accordingly. Or when your phone tells you that you've gotten a notification and you call the health board, then they will give you guidance on how to act and maybe you isolate and stay home. So these kinds of arguments we had for a lot of attacks. It's quite a long document if you go and look at it in the code repository. The security requirements were a little bit more boring. We were following the Estonian e-government principles of decentralization and also requirements from ENISA's cybersecurity requirements and testing for COVID-19 apps report. And actually, yeah, there were two groups of requirements, my apologies. And these were things like which are like generic, not specific to any attack, but like overall best practices. You can also find them in the documentation. So then we had the interesting part of the engineering, the security engineering and privacy engineering. And we had 5 groups of controls. My apologies for the typo on the slide again. There were organizational controls, like who delivers the app, who does PR, how is the project managed. There were universal technical controls which can be deployed in the phone, the service, or in the development environment, which include secure channels, proper use of cryptography, and then measures in the phone, like we use authentication for infection confirmation because we don't want anybody to be able to mark themselves as ill if they are not. And we don't want people to use other people's identities when marking themselves as ill. So we need the authentication part. Other countries in the world do not have access to the kind of health and authentication infrastructure that we do. So they have had to build weaker systems in the end. But in our limitation is that because we are only relying on strong authentication, then currently in Estonia, you can mark yourself as ill if you are your user of Smart ID or Mobile ID. Additional authentication mechanisms might be rolled out in the future. Data minimization is another part. The phone doesn't have almost any interesting data on it that's accessible in the user app. We as developers of Hoya do not have access to the Bluetooth signaling layer. This is hidden from us. It's in the Android or iOS internals. Then there are the measures in the service, which are like standard stuff like input validation, also policies on hosting, how securely that is done, but also data minimization there. The whole data model of backend is maybe something like 2 tables with 2 columns. There just isn't much more because there's not anything there to collect. And finally, we also need to make sure that the developers do not inject anything into the app source code. So there's a whole code reviews and access control and delivery procedures that are being followed. And these are also detailed in the document. And to close this off, finally, we also have to make sure that what we promised, we actually do. So when we were nearing our launch in August, then we took each control and each requirement and assigned responsibility, who needed to make sure that it is tested, decided on how to test adherence to the requirement or control, and then did the testing activities, wrote down who did it, so we knew who was responsible if it turns out that it wasn't done well enough, and then we published the report. The report that you will find in the code repository has organization names for responsibility, the kind of activities that were taken to ensure that this particular security control was actually followed, and also the names of the organizations who promised me that this has been done. So how this will go on further is when we start making additional large releases to the app, we will go through this report again and see which parts do we need to check. When we are changing a typo here or there, then we will not go through full pen testing, penetration testing scenario anymore, only when we start changing something larger. And this was also something we agreed on with the penetration testing team. So that was all from me, and that was all on the security engineering part. And now I would be happy to respond to all the questions together with Arto. Thank you for listening.
Oh, thank you. And now, then you proposed kindly to answer to the questions, and I think that the best arrangement is that you are taking the questions from this this site. Start with this usual element. Actually, is the Bluetooth secure, and then please go.
Yes. So, is it safe to keep Bluetooth open in the phone? In recent mobile phone operating systems, the Bluetooth stacks are reasonably secure. So if your operating system is receiving updates, security updates, then you can assume that your Bluetooth stack is reasonably secure, and you will not be, it's going to be very hard for someone to actually attack you through the Bluetooth channels. The nice thing about working internationally is that the DP3T project team also has researchers who are experts in Bluetooth and Bluetooth security. So also during the development phase, they were publishing papers on Bluetooth vulnerabilities, and we're also explaining which ones could affect the exposure notification API and which ones wouldn't. The nice thing about the exposure notification API is that it's quite a closed system, meaning that Apple and Google were able to tie it down pretty hard. For example, if you are on iOS and you try to build an app that listens to the exposure notification Bluetooth beacons, then you cannot, because iOS will not forward the exposure notification signals from other phones to your app. It will filter them out. So it's sort of a closed loop system, which makes it a little bit more secure at the cost of not being fully open. So my response would be that if your phone has security updates from the vendor or software vendor, then you should be safe. I do like the next question, so if I can take it as well. How and based on which criteria do you judge if the app has been successful in the end? This is something where we are working with an European team and trying to agree on which metrics do we actually use. And the nice part here is the Swiss have done a lot of work for us. They have built a whole metrics system, as have the Dutch people in the Netherlands. And there are multiple metrics that you want to look at. What you are interested in, the amount of keys being uploaded. So based on all people who are diagnosed as ill, how many of them will go through with the upload of keys? Given that everything is voluntary, using the app is voluntary. We forgot to stress that heavily enough, so I'll do it here. Everybody, this app is voluntary, and that's important. And then also uploading your key, saying that you're ill to this app, it's also voluntary. So some people start the process but do not finish it. And yeah, this is fine. We have to accept that. So we also lose some of the signal there. Then there comes the question of how many people do we reach that the manual contact tracing doesn't reach? And this is also something that we can measure in the call centers of the health board. And then there are metrics like how many people will actually use the app and so on. So there's a whole dashboard of metrics that we have designed and that we are putting together. And there's also the chance that sometime in the future, a research team will come, maybe in Estonia, maybe an international one, and start putting together a meta-analysis of how this app has worked in different countries. What the Swiss told us is that given that Estonia has such an advanced digital health ecosystem, then we are in a good position to do great monitoring and great measurements if we can figure out the privacy aspects here, especially. So Juhani, that's a great question. Thank you for asking this. After, do you also want to take some, like the anonymous question on mobile ID and smart ID?
Is your mic on? But this kas minu mikker on sees või? Okay, then I think that this question about the portal, actually how you can access the portal, No, this is actually the portal question and is not so much actually related to the HOIA.
In some ways,
Okay, please.
is it on now? Yeah, okay. In some ways, it is also related to HOIA because it is possible, like in other countries who do not have this electronic medical records at all, or this mobile ID or smart ID based authentication at all, it is possible to build alternative authentication channels, and the app team is actually thinking about it. So it is on our to-do list, but it did not fit into the first release. So this will be a solution for those people who do not have mobile ID, who do not have smart ID, or also for the people who are too young to be able to authorize the medical record system to share the infection status with the app, which would be everybody under 13. So for those people, in the future updates, we think there will be another channel, another authentication channel.
Kuidas aega? Time.
Next question is, when somebody sits next to an infected person in the bus for longer than 15 minutes, will the notification come immediately or later? The short answer is later. Longer answer is that this is not how it is supposed to work. If you already know you are ill, you are not supposed to go on the bus in the first place. So the intention of the app is not that when I am ill, I can activate this, I can register myself as ill in the app, and this is my free ticket to go to party anyway. Okay. This is not the intention. The intention is that this is how you will be able to notify people who you were in contact with before you learn that you are ill. If you already know that you are ill, you stay home. That's a proper way to do it. And then this is why if you sit next to somebody on a bus, then this somebody will learn tomorrow that they are ill, and they will mark themselves as ill in the application, and then you will get notifications that you were in the recent past in contact with somebody who was ill, who has later found out that they are ill. So, yes.
Yeah.
Next one.
Yes. Proximity data is not never leaving the phone.
Yeah, well, this is, I would say technically the question is wrong. The proximity data never leaves phone, even when you are ill. When you are ill, what you share is the list of keys, but the information about who you have been close to never leaves your phone. This matching of observed keys versus known infected keys happens in your phone. This information never leaves your phone.
Statistics is
the statistics of the app, number of downloads, number of active apps, number of users declared ill, some of this is included in, sometimes this number is included in the press releases. When you see the press releases from the National Health Board, they are daily reporting the number of known infected people, for example, and often those press releases also include statistics about HOIA. I don't know where else would be even a good place to make those numbers available. I don't think it's really feasible to go and update the HOIA website every day, or maybe it is.
Okay. So just some ideas here. In Switzerland, they have built a pretty large dashboard of metrics that is being continuously updated. So this is certainly on the roadmap for Estonia, but given that our development resources have been limited, this has not been built yet.
What do you think when it will be built, or what do you expect? Do you expect it to be sometimes online, or does it actually lack the resources, or do you have some kind of idea when it could happen? This dashboard.
No, I do not. I cannot give any deadlines right now.
Okay, clear.
So next question is, do you need the newest version of the phone OS to use HOIA, as it is based on guidance that did not exist before May? As I already briefly mentioned, you do not need necessarily updates to the operating system kernel. You do need to receive updates to the, in Android's case, for example, you do need to receive updates from the Google Play, for the Google Play services from Google. But for example, on Android, this GAN API has been backported to Android versions starting from 6.6.0. So you do not need to have the latest version of the operating system kernel, but you do need to download updates from the respective app store.
So 6 and up, yeah.
For Android 6 and up, and for iOS, I don't remember for sure, but I think it was 13.5 that you need, to which Apple has backported this service.
So this is maybe we don't know this answer.
Yeah, so next question is how many Hoya users does it take to saturate the spectrum for 2.4 gigahertz Wi-Fi? I don't really know. Dan, do you know?
I don't know, unfortunately. This is something that we will have to look up. We know that there has been testing done in Singapore by Apple, by Google, and the Swiss team, and they have decided that Bluetooth proximity testing is feasible. So this had to be something they tested.
So interesting question.
Mm-hmm.
I think that this Bluetooth vulnerabilities, now this is actually again a platform question. Actually, it's not so much actually related to the.
Actually, I did look at this, and I may be wrong, but after looking at this provided link for 3 minutes, my first guess is it's not, because it is about intercepting existing connections, and this tracing doesn't actually even establish connections. So it's unlikely to be exploitable. So I think
also, and apparently, if you look very closely, then I did not look at this before, but this is something. This attack has been developed at EPFL. If you look at the website, and EPFL is the same school that works on DP3T. So I think I know that the people who found this attack are also in the DP3T team. I would have to check to be sure, but I think I know the paper that this is based on, and I know that this doesn't affect Hoya. I will have to be checked to make sure, 100% sure, but it's pretty certain.
So for the next question, the ones that is currently on top of the list, actually, I think they come from the same person, because if I reorder the questions in my head according to when they were posted, they form a thread. So the first one is, the app is free software but cannot be used without Google and Apple, and that's a pity. So the response to that one is that most people have Google or Apple phones in their pockets, and that's what we were targeting. The protocol is open. If you want, you can build a compatible implementation on a Raspberry Pi, for example. I know people have done it, but this was not a priority, because there are very few people in Estonia who run around with Raspberry Pi in their pocket. So we were targeting those people who form the majority. Then the next one is.
I can also.
This one also.
I have also ideas here. So let's consider devices that are F-Droids and similar. So obviously these were being considered, and the whole idea of Google Play service being mandatory is something that is sort of a necessary evil is too strong of a term. But indeed, in order to make the exposure notification API accessible on all Android phones, Google had to put it in Google Play Services, because Google Play Service is the only thing that's common almost on all Android phones, unless you want to build it in the kernel. And Google Play Services also has a lot of other features that you might not call privacy preserving. So the question is correct, and I would also be happy to tell you that there are projects in place to build compatible devices like bracelets, which are separate totally and do not have any extra features, and are basically just other compatible hardware that will be compatible with the exposure notification API. And this might happen. It will create a lower cost device that won't do anything else.
So the next question is, what is goal amount of people reached to download the app in Estonia? I don't know. I haven't set any goals. Dan, maybe you know what there is a general goal?
We would like to have 50% of the smartphone population, which is around 400,000 people. At that point, we would already know that the app will have a significant impact. And there is hope that this can be reached with certain campaigns and so on. Because based on the surveys that have been done among people, the percentage of citizens who would consider an app has been 80%. So setting the goal on 50 among smartphone users is actually doable, I think.
And I think that we hope actually in the university to get 80, so we can actually quite safely actually keep the university open and have the people reacting on those infections actually rightfully and on time. Vabandust, ma tean, ma kohe lõpetan.
Yeah, so the next question is again trusting Google Apple to keep the keys and data secure on the user's device.
Hakka üles panema.
In some ways, like Dan explains, this is a necessary evil, but if you already carry a Google or Apple phone in your pocket, you are trusting them with a lot more already. And so probably adding the Hoya app just into the stack is not so much extra. At least that's my personal feeling.
Okay, and we are running out of time, so I thank first actually presenters and also the listeners. I hope that you get actually some indications also where to look the data, so you can form your understanding how secure this app is and whether you would actually recommend to people to use it. So thank you for listening. We are closing now. Thank you.